On the last day of 19th century, a man in England, aged almost 60, reflects on the bleak atmosphere of his mind and the outside landscape, and tries to balance it with a hope of which he is quite unaware of. I am talking about the famous English poet Thomas Hardy and one of his famous poems, The Darkling Thrush. Originally titled as By the Century's Deathbed, the poem was first published on 29th December 1900 in the weekly illustrated journal The Graphic. Later, the poem was published on 1st January 1901 in the famous English daily The London Times. In the same year, it was included in Hardy's second collection of English poetry, Poems of Past and the Present. The poem is an informal ode to the turn of a century and to a scruffy bird in a winter landscape. But before we move on to the summary and line by line explanation of the poem, let us discuss in brief the major events that influence Hardy's poetic world. Thomas Hardy was born in 1840 in a rural village in Dorset. His childhood and adult life in the country of Dorset was an inspiration for much of his literature. His lived experiences of country life influenced his idyllic representations as well as class structures. The second major incident that influenced Hardy's career was that he married twice, which was unusual for the time. He married Emma Gifford in 1874, and after her death in 1912, he married his secretary Florence Emily Dugdale in 1914, who was 39 years junior than him. He remained preoccupied with his first wife's death and tried to overcome his remorse by writing poetry. Often considered to be a Victorian realist, Hardy was influenced by a variety of sources, from Milton to the Romantics and even John Stuart Mill. Continuous themes that feature in his works are the role of religion in defining social norms, marriage, education, and his era's gender and class inequalities. Two of his major novels, Tales of the D'Urbervilles, published in 1891, and Jude the Obscure, published in 1895, by their frank handling of sex and religion, aroused the hostility of conventional readers. The outcry which followed the appearance of Jude the Obscure led Hardy in disgust to abandon novel writing. Hardy makes man an insignificant part of the world and depicts him as struggling against powers which are greater than himself and which delight in making human affairs go wrong. These powers are forces of nature, chance, accident, love, or social systems. The ruthless operation of their malign powers makes human life a misery. In Hardy, destiny is character, and not as in Shakespeare, character is destiny. His view of life was entirely different from that of his great contemporaries Tennyson and Browning. It was one of the stark pessimism excellently sum up at the end of his novel The Mayor of Casterbridge. Happiness was but the occasional episode in a general drama of pain. If we look into Hardy's characters, we find that they are mostly ordinary men and women living close to the soil. He did not adopt the psychological method of characterization as was done by George Eliot and Meredith. He put a stress on the emotional side of his characters rather than on the intellectual part of them. The poem Darkling Thrush is remarkable for the stark juxtaposition of despair and hope, suggesting the bleakness of winter and the unexpected joy of a song. It contrasts the harsh realities of winter with the hopeful song of a thrush, suggesting the possibility of renewal. The first two stanzas describe the bleak wintry landscape and the feeling of lifelessness that it produces. In the third stanza, the melancholy atmosphere is transferred with the appearance of a blast-befuddled, aged, frail, small, gaunt thrush. The last stanza muses that as there is no such reason for an aesthetic outburst, the thrush's singing must have been inspired by some blessed hope of which the poet is completely unaware of. The historical poetic references that Hardy deliberately uses throughout the poem begins with the very title, The Darkling Thrush. The word darkling means to become dark, and it reminds us of poets using these words from the mid 15th centuries up to the Victorian era. It reminds us of John Milton using these words in Book 3 of Paradise Lost while describing the nightingale. The wakeful bird sings darkling. It reminds us of John Keats and his famous 1819 Ode to a Nightingale. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death. Matthew Arnold, in his famous poem Dover Beach, uses the word darkling, and we are here as on a darkling plain. The word darkling thrush is symbolic in the sense that the aged, blast-befuddled thrush which brings to us the blessed hope, it brings it at the time of evening. So, the message of hope came at a time of dark. I leaned upon a coppice gate when frost was a spectre grey, and winter's dregs made desolate the wakening eye of day. At the very beginning of this lecture, I told that this is an ode, but this is different from the traditional ode. This is a very informal type of ode and begins with the first person. I leaned upon a coppice gate. Coppice refer to little wood of a small trees, and gate is here very symbolic. Gate is a doorway to a new place, and it is assumed that the poem was written on the last day of 19th century. So, at the doorway of 20th century. So, the gate is very symbolic here, and the pose of which the first line talks about is a pose of reflection, is a pose of thinking. When frost was a spectre grey, so frost made the landscape as grey as a ghost, an usage of metaphor. And winter's dregs, Dregs refers to the leftover bits, the last portion of a drink, and it reminds us of Tennyson's uses of the same type of words in Ulysses. I'll drink life to the lees. And winter's dregs made desolate the wakening eye of day. Eye of day refers to the sun. It is a case of periphrasis where instead of saying it directly to sun, it makes a roundabout description of sun. We find also the usage of these kinds of periphrases regarding sun in Shakespeare's Shall I Compare Thee to Summer's Day. The tangle bine steams escort the sky. Tangle bine steam refers to the dried out steams of binewood and escort that curves the sky like strings of a broken lyre. A case of simile and explicit comparison between two dissimilar things. And lyre here reminds us of the usage of the same word lyre by P.B. Shelley in his famous Ode to the West Wind. And all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. So all the human beings, they obtained the warmth of their household fires. So the place is completely desolate. And the bleakness of winter is intensified with the gulmi G sound and the D sound which dominate this stanza in gate, spectre grey, desolate, dregs, even day, which symbolizes joy, is again described as weakening, and the only color which is left here is the color grey. So the lifelessness and the picture of hopelessness which is expressed in the first stanza is continued again in the second stanza with more strong words. The land's sharp features seem to me the century's corpse outlined. He scraped the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. A number of explicit comparisons where the landscape is compared as the corpse of the century, the sky as the tomb of the century, and the wind as the funeral song. The land sharp features seems to be the century's corpse outlined. Century here is capital, like the frost and winter of the first stanza. So this capitalization of these words, it symbolizes that these words are given more importance than the other words. Century's corpse outlined. Outlined means stretched out, one of Hardy's own compounds. He scraped the cloudy canopy. Crypt is a room usually underneath a church and used to bury the dead. Canopy refers to the cloudy sky hanging over the scene. The wind is death lament. Again the wind here is imagined as lamenting the death of that century. We find a reference to Shelley's West Wind again. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. The ancient pulse refer to the life force. The ancient pulse of germ, that is a state from which things can grow. So the ancient life force of germ and birth, they are shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless. Fervorless means empty of passion as I. So here we find that poet is equating himself with that bleak wintry landscape. The rhyming of birth and earth of the 5th line and the 7th line of this stanza is negated by dry and I of the 6th and 8th line of this stanza. And again the usage of alliteration in this stanza, it intensifies the bleakness of that atmosphere, cloudy canopy, centuries corpse. 2 stanzas, they gives us a picture of a lifeless wasteland. In the 3rd stanza, we find a difference. Suddenly that melancholy atmosphere is transferred with the appearance of a thrush, an ordinary bird. At once a voice arose, that is burst out. The bleak twigs overhead in full-hearted even song of joy illimited. 3 run-on lines, okay, before coming to a semicolon. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead in full-hearted even song. Even song refers to a religious form of song sung in the evening, and it is sung mostly in the Anglican churches. An even song of joy illimited. So, illimited, that is unlimited, of unlimited joy. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to flange his soul upon the growing gloom. So, an aged thrush, an old thrush, frail, that is feeble, gaunt, thin and small, in blast beruffled plume. Blast referred to a very strong gust of wind. Beruffled means disordered, scruffy. So, the thrush which came here in this stanza, which appeared in this stanza, is an old one and also experienced that strong gust of wind, and for that its feathers become completely disordered, it become completely scruffy. Had chosen thus to flange, that is throw forcefully upon this growing gloom. Growing gloom refers to the deepening twilight as the night approaches. So little cause for carolings of such aesthetic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around, that I could think there tremble through his happy good night air some blessed hope, whereof he knew and I was unaware. One remarkable thing is that in the last stanza we find a difference. In the first stanza, in the 4th line, there was a pause. In the first 2 stanzas, there were full stop after the 4th line. In the 3rd stanza, there was a semicolon, but in the last stanza, there is no pause. Run-on lines. So little cause for carolings. Carolings, that is singing, which is reminiscent of Christmas carols. Of such aesthetic sound, there is no cause of joy. Of such aesthetic sound was written on terrestrial things. Terrestrial things refers to do with the art, the landscape here. Afar, that is in the distance, or nigh around or nearby around, that I could think that tremble through. Tremble through, that is shake slightly. His good night, his happy good night air. Air refers to the tune of that thrush. Some blessed hope. So, this blessed hope, it is one of the 3 Christian virtues: faith, hope and charity. The poet here we find that balances that bleak wintry atmosphere with the song of the thrush, and it is very remarkable that Hardy here chooses an ordinary thrush, not a nightingale in the manner of Milton or in the manner of the romantic poets. And the thrush is an aged one, a feeble one, a small one, and someone who has gone through the strong wind. In the 3rd stanza, we find that Hardy chooses this aged thrush which has gone through that strong gust of wintry winds that the poet describes at the first two stanzas, and this is what makes Hardy different from others. Not a nightingale in the Miltonic or romantic tradition, but an ordinary aged thrush. In the last stanza, there is a religious overtone with in the words carolings, which is reminiscent of Christmas carols, and that blessed hope, okay, of which the bird is quite aware of, but the poet is completely unknown to. Okay. And this is how he balances that despair and hope. Okay. And again, if we look into the rhyme scheme of that, or the meter of that poem, we find that it is a ballad stanza poem where the iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter lines are used alternately, and this tight rhyming gives the poem a kind of an authority. But we find besides that tight rhyming, the meter of the poem is quite relaxed, and this is how again a kind of balance that Hardy did in that poem. The poem is again typical of Hardy's work in that it shows life on earth, and again it is also typical in praising the unconquerable spirit and in its firm unwillingness to state a clear conclusion, balancing hope and pessimism. If you have any queries, any observations, any agreements, disagreements, feel free to express that in the comment box. Thank you very much for watching the video.